The creative process can be thought of the arena in which artist meets paint and paint meets the artist's own unique vision. My name is Yupari, and I'd like to welcome you to this week's portrait painting demonstration. For the majority of the painting today, I will be using primarily synthetic brushes, but I'll start off with a size 2 filbert brush, but I'll get more into that later. For my mediums, to the left of my cup here, I have just regular odorless mineral spirits, and to the right I have a combination that is 1 part stand oil to 4 parts mineral spirits. To create that mixture, you could do anything. You could do 1 teaspoon of stand oil to 4 teaspoons mineral spirits, however you like. And for some reason my paints decided to be extra oily today, so I put them on some paper towel for a couple minutes so it would soak out the excess oil. And before we get started with the demonstration, I have some very special thank yous to make. On my Instagram, I really wish I could pronounce your name. I really don't want to butcher it, but thank you so much for following along my videos and painting along with them. This really made my day. Thank you so much to the two of you. And here we have our model, Netta, and I'm going to have her to the top left corner of the screen for the entire duration of the painting so you can follow along with me. I'm going to read out my colors to you starting from the top left. So we have titanium white, zinc white, raw umber, alizarin crimson, cadmium red light, cadmium orange, cadmium yellow, yellow ochre, sap green, cerulean blue, cool blue, and ivory black. And I'm working on a regular piece of masonite board that I gessoed with Liquitex Professional Acrylic Gesso, and I toned it with a neutral gray acrylic paint once the gesso dried. Alright, getting started here, I'm going to be using my size 2 filbert bristle brush with raw umber as my drawing color. And the reason I'm using the filbert brush to start off with is that the filbert brush is really good at making a very definitive mark. So it's very similar to a piece of medium vine charcoal in the way that it handles. And for the paint, I'm using perhaps just 2% odorless mineral spirits to 98% oil paint. And the way that I'm creating that mixture is pretty much the way I created it was I just dipped the brush lightly in my mineral spirits and dried it as much as I could with the paper towel, and then applied the brush to the paint. In the beginning, I really just want to establish my working space. So I have a basic shape for the outside of the head. I'm not trying to make a perfect linear outline by any means. And for the head, I just have a basic shape that should encapsulate the entire structure of the head. And now I'm going to go in with this long line across, and this line is going to be my center line, and now I'm going to start to put in the axis of the eyes. So the center line really helps me to gauge the turn that the model is making relative to me, and the turn that the model is making relative to me is pretty much a 3/4 turns. That is, we're seeing 3/4 of her face and the rest is turned away from us. Now I'm going to put in just a little mark for the nose. Again, nothing is set in stone here. The only thing I'm doing is I'm gathering information. So I'm trying to figure out what is the turn that the model is making in relation to me, and where do I want to place the head. So where is the turn? What is the turn that the model is making relative to me, and where do I want to place the head on the surface? That's it. That's all that I want for the start of the painting. And for the start of a painting, you really don't have to hit the ground running. The start of a painting doesn't have to be such a perfect and beautiful thing. It really doesn't have to be. We can start off as messy as we want. All we want to do is place 3 things inside of one big thing. 3 things being the set of eyes, the nose, and the mouth. So really it's 4 things, but I'm simplifying it down to 3 things. Notice how I started out both eyes, unified them with just one messy line indicating the axis of the eyes. And now I'm starting to carve out some more shapes for the outside of the model's face, but I don't know what they are yet. I really can't know with any degree of specificity what my shapes are going to look like in relation to one another until I have them next to one another. So I'm placing down, just using my eye, simple marks for the eyes, the nose, and the mouth. So the eyes, I really want to pay attention to the angle between the eyes and the distance between the eyes. But first, I'm trying to figure out the angle between the eyes. So obviously the eye to the right of the panel is a little bit higher than the eye to the left, but how much, not certain yet. So I'm going to make a mark, and then I'm going to step back and I'm going to relate all these shapes to one another. At this point, it's just simple shapes of light and shadow, or pretty much just light and dark. I'm just sketching in very loosely a little bit for the hair, and now this is not intended to be the final value or even the final colors that I'll place onto these dark regions of the painting. I'm pretty much just trying to gather information, and I'm trying to work in such a way that I can understand this arena of which that I'm working in. I may have the proportions completely off. I may have them maybe 50% off. That's pretty off, but that's better than zero. In the beginning, I have zero. I'm 0% correct, and in the beginning, I'm maybe 20% correct. And as the painting develops, the drawing will get more accurate as I have more of my shapes to relate next to one another. But the beginning is really a building process. We want to have something down that we can build on top of, and that idea of constructing is pretty much why I'm using straight lines and angles in the way that I'm doing, because with a straight line you can really definitively say where one point ends and another point begins. Notice the angle of the neck is a very definitive angle. I know where it ends and I know where it begins. And then another angle across the other side of the face. I know where that angle starts and I know where that angle ends. That is, I know where the line of the outside of the model's face now begins and I know where it ends. That's the advantage of using straight lines. The thing that matters here is that you're gathering information that you can work from. And it's not so much that you're getting the eyes, the nose, and the mouth in just the right place. That oftentimes doesn't happen. It's a building process. And I think that it's important to try to train your eye by just drawing like this with the holding the brush as far back as you can, staying at least an arm's length away, working freely with straight lines and angles, bouncing your eye back and forth from the model to your picture. Just bouncing your eyes back and forth to gauge what your proportions are, and keeping the eyes and the nose and the mouth simple. So we're having place markers for each feature. And the eye socket is simplified into one simple, almost L-looking shape. Each eye socket is simplified into almost a simple L-looking shape. It's almost like a rectangle missing the other side of the rectangle, or more like a parallelogram, but you get the point. Simple shapes that I can push around and work with. And with the eyes, I want to stay away from any kind of details. At this stage, I don't want to do anything more to the eyes than just a single brush stroke, because I can move around a brush stroke with a lot of facility, but I can't move around a drawn out eye as easily. So I'm going to hold back from drawing as much information on the eyes as I can. So now I'm going in with a piece of paper towel, and I'm going to use this kind of as an eraser now. to push some of the shapes around. Notice still not trying to put too much information into the eyes, just trying to figure out the placement of the eyes in relation to one another, that is the angle of the eyes with this single brushstroke from one eye to the other. I want to know the angle between the two eyes, and I want to know the distance between them. And so here's what's going on in my head. So first, the distance between the two eyes is fairly standard, like the standard canon of proportion. So that is the distance optically between one eye and the other is approximately the length of one of the eyes. Approximately that. So that is the distance between one end of the eye and another end of the eye is equal to the total length of one eye itself. And now, what about the angle of the eye? The angle of the eyes in relation to one another. What is that angle? It's definitely not a 45-degree angle. In the beginning, we started it off pretty much 45-degree angle because that's the simplest angle for me to make. But now I'm noticing that that angle is very subtle. It's a slight angle. So that's the vocabulary going on in my head. It's a slight angle with the eye to the right of the panel being a little bit higher than the eye to the left, but still, of course, on the same axis. So the axis is the line between the two eyes, and the angle is very small angle, with the eye to the right of the panel being just a little bit higher. And we're going to further articulate that as we go, but that's the vocabulary that's going on in my head. And just by the nature of things, your painting can look a certain way 1 foot away from you, and it will look completely different, say 5 feet away. And it's that 5 feet away that you really want to perfect, because that really is what people will see. So now stepping back, I noticed that, of course, I had that eye still a little bit too far down. That is the eye to the left. So I'm trying to move it up just a little bit, and at the same time working the surrounding shapes, still keeping the shapes simple as possible so that I can work with. So I like to think of painting in just 3 factors: shape, value, and color. So the value, any kind of value, okay, let's picture a circle. You can have hundreds of different little values inside of one outlined circle. And now with any particular value, you can have a lot of variations of color within that value. So shape, value, color. So I want to know what is the shape of a particular area, which is what I'm doing right now. And then I'm going to focus on what is that particular value in my head. And then I'm going to place down a color once I know what the value is going to be. But now the shape. A little peculiar thing here. I don't want the drawing to be a picture perfect finished drawing. I don't want that, and the reason being is because I want to work out the remaining shapes in color. So we're going to use color to continue to build the drawing. So we're going to be working with color pretty early on into the painting. First, I wanted to have just a basic understanding of where the shapes are going to be in relation to one another, and the drawing may be perhaps 70–80% figured out in terms of the placements of things, but I want to figure out the rest of the shapes with color, and that's primarily for logistical reasons, because painting with paint in this way, where we're applying the paint directly onto the surface and sculpting out the forms, is a pretty efficient way to work. It can make drawing a little bit difficult at first, But once we get acquainted with the medium of oil paint, the only difference between drawing with graphite or drawing with charcoal, the only difference between drawing with graphite and charcoal and oil paint is the medium. Once you learn how to handle the medium, then you can really learn how to draw with it. So now if you notice, I switched to a different brush. Now this is a synthetic brush. It's a synthetic size 4 filbert now. And I'm going to be establishing my darks fairly early on, and here's a paint handling thing. So I started off with a little more medium with this dark. So that is probably 95% oil paint to 5% odorless mineral spirits, and the way that I got that was, of course, to dip the brush first into the medium, dry it as much as I could, and then started to apply the paint. Now here's the trick. Using a little more medium into your darks will make the darks settle or fade into the surface. So that dark that you're seeing right now throughout the painting will fade into the surface, and once it starts to fade, I'm going to apply more paint onto the dark masses of the hair, as much paint as I can with as little medium as I can. Now the thing with the darks is if you use too much medium with your dark values, it will dry to look more grayed out, more opaque, which is fine. You can apply a retouch varnish to that. That's okay. But I found that with myself, I'm trying to use more and more paint, less and less medium in my dark shapes. Now with the background color that I'm placing, the reason I'm placing in the background color is because I want to have all of my darks figured out first. And by figured out, I don't mean finished, because this background is obviously not this green and it's not this light. And so again, I'm using a little bit more medium into my darks first, just to allow the paint to settle into the board, to settle into the surface that I'm working on. And this is the same with any canvas that you're working on or any kind of linens. As long as you gessoed it adequately, that is, I really like the Liquitex Professional acrylic gesso. I'm starting to really like that gesso. And this is a fan brush that I'm using. It's a big cheap synthetic brush, probably from the dollar store or something like that. And I just use it to pat down the paint in a particular direction to eliminate glare. And now already some of the dark that I placed in the hair settled in to the surface. So it settled in and it started to dry, but not dry in the sense of dry to the touch, but just started to fade into the surface a little bit. So now that's a point where I will start to add more paint and less medium to the hair. And I'm going to let this settle in as well. So I'm putting in a lot of paint and I'm going to let this settle into the hair, and then later on add a little bit more paint to the dark of the hair and less medium. So I'm building the surface of the painting in this way, as opposed to just trying to place the single brushstroke and then just leaving it there. I've learned recently with my paint handling, it's a little bit easier with the darks, and I mean with the darks. The dark of the hair is fairly dark, to build the darks, starting off with a consistency that's a little bit more medium, and then letting it settle in, and then applying more and more paint with less and less medium as the painting progresses. And now I'm going to go in and establish a value, just a dark, simple value, not quite as dark as the dark of the hair, but fairly dark for the dark shapes onto the face now. I have a simple blob here for the nose, and the reason that I'm making the shapes like this is so that I can come back in and further refine them. I'm just placing in simple dark masses for where I think the eyes are going to go, the nose, and then for the form shadow beneath of the model's jaw. And let's talk about the creative process in which the artist uses the paint to create what they envision. So oftentimes what we envision in our minds is not what we place down on the painting. I'm going to make that clear. And what that means is we see a picture in our head and we try to paint it and it doesn't look like what we want it to paint. And that is because this process is a building process. It doesn't have to start off the way we think that it's going to look. And painting itself is not such a linear thing. The artist doesn't just place a brushstroke down and it's in the right spot every time. The artist doesn't just draw a perfect line drawing and then it's going to be perfectly fine the next day. Sometimes we make a painting, come back maybe a week later and just say, oh my goodness, what did I do here? And then go back and rework the painting. It is not a linear process. It's something that we build on. That being said, so for the flesh tones that I'm starting to develop, I started out with the plane of the glabella. The glabella is the region on the face, the only region of the face that has that warm skin tone-ish color. That's the glabella. And a plane you can think of as just a three-dimensional sheet of paper, if you will. A flat sheet of paper in three-dimensional space. In fact, your canvas or your panel is a plane in space, just a flat surface in three-dimensional space. The two-dimensional process of drawing with straight lines and angles can be further developed in terms of thinking in 3 dimensions with planes. So a plane such as this area that I'm applying here is kind of analogous to a straight line used to draw, say, a curve. Say you draw a curve with a series of straight lines and angles to get a very specific curve. So the three-dimensional way of looking at that is to construct the volume of a curve using a series of planes. A series of planes to construct the overall curvature of a form, and then making it to a smooth finish as it develops. So how do you do that? So you have to choose an area of the form that's receiving the most light, and you have to relate all of your values based on that area that's receiving the most light. And since we're working with oil paint, and oil paint has a limited amount of values that we can use, it's nowhere near the endless set of values and colors in nature. So how do we emulate and how do we represent using our limited number of values that we can attain with oil paint to represent something that has a seemingly unlimited number of values and color, which is nature? So how do we represent that? And so the way we do that is to optimize, to do the most that we can with every single value. So again, let's get a little bit into what's going on in my mind as I start to apply these colors. So first thing I do is ask myself, what is this area in value? And so that area in value, whatever area I'm painting, has a relation to the light. So what is this area in relation to the light? Where is this area physically in relation to the light? Say this area right here to the corner of the eye, receiving a fair amount of light, but not as much light as, say, the top right corner of the eye to the right of the panel. So I look at each shape and I think of where it is spatially on the model to help me get an understanding of what that value is, but then I think about just the value. What is that value? Once I figure out the value in my head, then I start to think, oh, well, what is this color in relation to the surrounding colors? So say the color uh, above the model's left eye, that eye that's a little bit higher on the angle, that area above the eye, to me perceptually, is a little bit cooler than the surrounding area. So that is, it's a little bit more on the green, and that's kind of pushing it. It's a little bit more on the gray kind of uh, flesh tone area. So first I think, what is that value in relation to the other values? And then I think about the color. So once I think about the color, then I just place it down. As long as I know what the value is, I can play with the color as much as I want, because there's an endless set of colors within each shape of value, in theory, of course. Now I'm going to be painting an area right here across the zygomatic region of the model's face. So that is the cheekbone top plane of the face. This area is fairly light. It's lighter than the values within the eye. So I painted it lighter, and I also saw that it was a little bit more on the orangey pinkish yellow side. And so that's the kind of loose thinking that goes on in my head in terms of the color. The color is something that I've been trying to push a little bit further with my paintings. So much further that I'm actually thinking a lot more of the color than I used to. If you remember my other videos, I pretty much downplayed color as much as I could, and that was because I really wanted to get a strong understanding of the values. And so now I'm thinking more and more of the colors in relation to one another. This area is more pink, this area is more green, this area is more of a lavender purple. That's the kind of conversation going on in my head. And the way to do that is to kind of train yourself in multitasking. And I know it sounds really terrible. Look at this area of the nose. I'm just painting it just a simple, dark, warm value. So here's what's going on in my head for this area. So this area of the nose, I'm painting it a little bit darker and warmer than I need it to be, so that I can go back in and add more lighter colors and more darker colors if I need to, which I will. But that whole area, I thought of its value first, and kind of with my intuition, I painted it a little bit warmer. So let's think as much as we can about the value, and then let our intuition do a little bit of the work for the color development. So it may seem that we are juggling drawing, value, and color all at the same time, and that can be pretty much a terrifying thing to think about. But let's not juggle anything. Let's do this all in one smooth and unifying fashion, such that we understand exactly at what place that we stand on in terms of the development of the painting. And so the way that I'm doing that is, first and foremost, using my oil paint to further develop the drawing. That's it. That is the one smooth and continuous idea that's going on in my head. I'm just using oil paint to further develop this drawing. And I'm thinking of this painting as a drawing. I'm just drawing it with color. That's all I'm doing. And I'm still in that information gathering kind of state of mind. And if that sounds too analytical, let's just say I'm still trying to figure out where the places fit, where the pieces fit in place. That's all I'm trying to figure out. Thinking of the side of the face here, this value, this whole area value in general is a little bit darker than, say, the right side of the face relative to the panel. So this area right here is a little bit darker in value, but what is its color in relation to the surrounding areas? I see it, I perceive it to be a little bit more on the orangey, alizarin, raw umber, yellow ochre side. And I may be reading out the mixtures, but I'm not sure. I perceive it to be warmer, deeper and warmer than the right side of the face, and I just perceive it to be that way. I'm using my intuition to paint that color, using my mind a little bit to figure out the value. And each area of paint that I'm applying it can be thought of as a plane. And I'm thinking of it in my head kind of as a plane, but there are times where I think about it two-dimensionally, just to simplify things. So an area of the painting, I'll say the left side of the model's face, that flat plane that I painted a little bit warmer, you could think about it two-dimensionally if you want to, and it would be fine. Say this area to the left eye on the left of the panel is receiving a little bit more light, so it's a little bit lighter two-dimensionally in my head. That piece of the picture is lighter than the surrounding areas, so you can think about it two-dimensionally if you want to. But I'm treating this as a type of sculpture, if you will. I'm thinking of it as a physical, tangible thing that I can sculpt, that I can work with. And I'm trying to establish as much of the planar thinking as I can so I can further mold these forms into more accurate forms as it develops. In terms of the creative process, with each individual shape that I'm painting, notice that area of the nose, I'm envisioning in my head, I'm laying down a simplified foundation of color onto the surface that I can further redefine and sculpt into the picture that exists in my head. So I'm trying to use the paint in such a way that I can cover the surface with enough paint and with enough information that I can come back in with my smaller size 1 synthetic brushes and further refine the shapes. So that's the creative process that's going on in my head. I have a picture in my head of what I want the painting to look like. I may not be able to verbalize it, but I have a picture in my head of what I want the painting to look like. Not particularly the photograph. I'm not trying to copy the photograph. I'm trying to observe the photograph, interpret it, and then paint it how I want to paint it. Now that doesn't mean that I'm not trying to capture the drawing, the proportions, or the color. I'm trying to capture that, but I'm aware that I see things the way you see things, which is differently than everyone else. There's always that little bit of difference in how we perceive an image. On the topic of perception, let's talk a little bit about my color perception that's going on here, because I'm not only am I building the planes on the face so that I can further refine it, but I'm also trying to think about the areas of color in relation to one another and further distinguish between them. I'm not trying to lose the overall unity of the face, but let's talk a little bit about the color variation here. So if we look at the area beneath of the nose, it's a little bit more of a greenish, of course lighter in value, but kind of a greenish tone. And I think what I used to obtain that was my cadmium yellow with my raw umber to create a green with my zinc white. And then the area to the right of it, right here, this area is of course a little bit darker in value, but it's also warmer, but it's not as, say, pink as the lips. And so I'm gauging that color in relation to the color of the lips, which I have not painted yet, but I know that it is not as bright pink. Now, as we move across the face, this area right here, I perceive it to be a little bit more on the golden ochre in relation to the colors surrounding it. So each individual piece of color that I'm painting it using my perception of what I believe that the color is. Not so much trying to copy down what the color is, but rather trying to paint what I perceive that color is in relation to the surrounding colors. I'm going to treat this whole section here, the orbicularis oris of the mouth, that muzzle-like structure that encapsulates the mouth. I'm going to treat this whole region here as one unified unit. And that area as a whole is a little bit darker in terms of value, so it is receiving less light than the areas above, closer to, say, the forehead. So I'm going to unify it as a darker value. I'm going to paint a little bit more on the side of it, this area here. Remember, I'd like to build up the darks using less and less medium as I go and more paint. But in any case, I'm going to treat that whole area around the mouth as one unified unit, and it's warmer, and I'm also going to think about that color in relation to the surrounding colors. I perceive the area beneath the mouth, this area right here, I perceive it to be a little bit more on the greenish side. Not bright green, anything like that. I perceive it to be cooler in color, a little bit more on the greenish side than the surrounding areas, but still having that pinkish kind of flesh tone color to it. And I want it to be cooler in temperature, but at the same time I want it to be a little bit more neutral in saturation. And so not only am I thinking about the hue of the particular color, but I'm also considering the saturation. At first, I'm going to push the saturation a little bit. So this whole region, I'm painting it a little bit more greenish, a little bit more of a bright greenish than need be, because I know that I'm trying to push the color differences in relation to one another, and then of course refine the color as it goes. You can think of a color, say the top plane of the cheekbone that's a little bit more on the yellowy pinkish side, related to another color above, say the model's left eye, which is a little bit more of the golden green ochre side. And you can pick these colors in relation to another, and you can exaggerate the color difference to a slight degree, or you can exaggerate it even more if you'd like to. But getting the relation between each individual hue and gauging the value properly will give you the condition of the light. So now the model is obviously not in a bright orange light, but the model is not in daylight either. And so the lighting that was used was actually just an electric lighting, I think a fluorescent light, fluorescent daylight, I believe. Not quite sure actually what bulb that was, but perceptually it's not a bright orange color, and it's not as cool as daylight, as a natural light, say using a window light as your light source. And so working the shapes and the colors in relation to one another will give you that type of condition of the light. So the light condition can be described by as accurately relating the shapes of color to one another as you can, while maintaining the values in relation to one another. So now, speaking of value, this area of value here, below the neck, to the left of the sternocleidomastoid, which is just a neck muscle, the little tubular looking muscle. Don't need to know the muscle, but this area right here that I'm painting optically is lighter than, say, the areas around the model's forehead. I perceive this area here a little bit lighter, and I'm going to push that value difference, and I'm also going to push the color difference because I see it a little bit more on the greenish yellowy side in relation to, say, an area like the forehead. So I'm going to push that closer to a blue. Then we're going to come back and refine it. And so this is called pushing the light, pushing the difference between light and dark, kind of similar to pushing contrast in a photograph. Pushing the value differences can also help you bring up the effect of light, but pushing it too much can also be a problem too. But in that case, I just wanted to push the value a little higher. And I like to work regions of the painting side by side relative to one another. So I'm going to go and paint the dark blue of the collar. This would have been a good time to have like ultramarine blue, but I didn't have ultramarine blue handy. So I just used the cerulean blue with a little bit of ivory black. And remember before, if you've seen my previous videos on the Zorn palette or other limited palettes, I think it's a good idea to use limited palettes as much as you can so you can learn how to mix the colors and then learn where you may need another color. So I felt like with the shirt I needed a deeper blue, a deeper, more purplish dark blue. And since I've used ultramarine blue before, I actually knew that I needed that color. But if I didn't know ultramarine blue existed, I would have searched for a darker and deeper blue to add to my palette only after learning where I needed it for. So I think it's a good idea to build from a limited palette, and then you can add as many colors as you can use. I think it's a good idea to learn the necessity of a particular color by starting off with a more limited palette. And of course now I'm starting to add more paint onto the hair. Remember, building the darks is a process, at least in my opinion, in paint handling, where you start off with a little bit more medium, let it settle in, and then add more and more layers of dark using less and less medium and just more and more straight paint. At this stage, it's pretty much just straight paint, not using any medium at all. And as I add more paint into the dark shapes of the hair, I'm going to also think about the background now. Remember, with the background, I made it a little bit too green in the beginning. So I'm going to go in and make the background color a little bit darker like it is in the reference, and a little bit less saturated. Still kind of green, but less saturated. So now as I fill in these values, let's talk about where the painting is and at what stage the painting is right now. So let's consider this a checkpoint. And so in this checkpoint, I have my big shapes of color and value established. And when my big shapes of color and value established, I do not want to lose my my differences between light and shadow, and I want to have something said in terms of color statements. The color statements are the variations in the shapes of color in relation to one another that I was talking about earlier. So I have that down. So I have my large shapes of value and color, and I have my color statements down, meaning I had areas a little bit more greenish, a little bit more pinkish, more yellow, pinkish, and so on. I have all of that down, and now is a time where I can start to build more specificity. So in this checkpoint, we are at a stage where the painting has its foundation laid down, with the exception of the mouth. I'm going to put in a simple shape for the mouth, similar to the nose and the eyes. But we have nearly finished the foundation of which we are going to build more specific shapes on. And when we get to the specific shapes, I'm going to use something that I'm going to call a pivot. For a pivot, I'm going to choose the eye to the right of the panel as an area that I'm going to develop and I'm going to render, and I'm going to use that to gauge all the surrounding shapes in relation to. But first, I need to have the foundation established. And now the hard part in terms of portraiture is that suppose the model came up to my painting right now and she's like, okay, like she's gonna be thinking, do I look like that? Is my nose that long? Um, Now the model, she's of course she's nice. She wouldn't say anything like that. But suppose we were in an art group and I was painting like this, just adding just a shape of red and then a shape of dark for the lips. Somebody walks up to my painting and of course they're going to wonder what I'm doing with my life. And that's not what we should think about. We shouldn't think about what other people are going to say when they look at our painting, especially at a stage like this. We're still just gathering information, and then we're going to lock into that information and we're going to build from it. But we need something to build from, and that's what this stage was all about. And so if you're working with a group of artists, I know it can be kind of scary to leave a painting at this stage and then hope that in future sittings you can build on it. And the answer is yes, you can build on it, as long as you consider the painting as a constructive process, a creative process. And in that process, the painting doesn't have to look a particular way, it doesn't have to be pretty, it doesn't have to be anything other than something that you understand and that you can construct from. Alright, so now let's start constructing. Let's start taking that mess that we just created and build on it. Now remember, the drawing didn't have to be perfectly finished in the raw umber stage where we were just drawing in simple shapes of light and dark, and neither did the drawing have to be super finished when we were laying in large masses of color. Now we can come in with the smaller brushes. This is a size 1 round brush. If you want to know exactly what brush it is a size 1 round brush from the art store Plaza. So what I'm going to do with this brush is I'm going to place 2 dots for the 2 tear ducts. Those are the 2 dark red dots, and I just use a alizarin crimson and raw umber for those 2 dots. Those 2 dots are going to help me gauge the angle between the 2 eyes. Remember, I was trying to figure out the angle between the 2 eyes before, and I said don't worry about it, we can come back in future stages and further solidify that angle, and this is the stage where we are going to solidify things. So now I'm going to lock on to that angle between the 2 red dots. Remember, a line is a pathway between 2 points, and that line is at a specific angle now that I will not mess with. I will leave that angle as it is and use it to construct more shapes on. And of course, if something goes wrong with it, that's not the end of the world, as long as you keep your shapes simple and easy to understand. As you may guess, the corrections will be simple and easy to understand. So now I'm coming in with my cool blue and a little bit of the zinc white. I'm using just a little bit of it for the white of the eyes, known as the sclera. Now I'm coming back in with more raw umber onto my dark brush. Now I have a dark brush and a light brush, so I can keep my mixtures organized. Just picking out simple shapes of light and dark for the placement of the 2 eyes. I want to make sure that I work both sides of the painting in terms of the placement of the eyes. Placing the eyes really isn't that difficult if you think about it as just 2 points in relation to one another, that being those 2 red dots that I placed for the tear ducts. And the angle of the eyes is now established. the distance of the eyes, not quite yet, so the distance between the two eyes is equal perhaps to the length of one eye, as I said before. So the distance between those two red dots that I placed should be equal to the width of each individual eye. And that's just an approximation made by my eye. And so now once we have the two eyes placed roughly in relation to one another as accurately as I can place them in terms of that angle between the two eyes, I'm going to now develop my pivot. And so my pivot is going to be the eye on the right of your screen. Now we're going to develop this eye. We're going to add multiple values to it, multiple colors, and I'm not going to deviate too much from the color scheme that I already chose. So remember that area above the eyelid here, this area here, I initially painted it as a little bit more green. So I pushed the hue a little bit greener in relation to the other colors because I perceive it to be a little bit cooler. But in any case, I'm not going to deviate too much from the large area of colors that I established. Rather, I'm going to use that initial color statement of it being a little bit more greenish to develop more subtle variations of value while still maintaining that hue. So the color doesn't matter too much now. It just matters that I maintain that color statement and that I build my shapes in relation to the light source. So I'm thinking of the light source hitting this structure that I'm painting. The lower eyelid that I just painted is receiving less light, and it's also a little bit warmer, so that's probably just a mixture of zinc white, alizarin crimson, and my raw umber. Now I'm sorry I don't have a view of my palette while I'm doing this. I only have one camera, but in the future I might have two cameras, so I'll be able to put in side footage of the palette while I do this. But I'm not spending too much time mixing anymore. I'm spending more time just picking and choosing colors that are already on my palette to add onto the development of this pivot. And now we're pretty much going to go to town with this pivot. We're going to try to render it as much as we can. I'm picking my lightest area here, and if you want to see a video that's a little more in-depth on the subject of form modeling, I have a video on that. So I'm going to post a link, I'm going to put a link in the description below so that you can see that video that talks more on form modeling. But in any case, we're picking areas that are receiving the most light. So I chose the area above the eyelid and the area on the white of the eye, the sclera, that's receiving more light, and I'm going to gradate the values according to that. Modeling the form is nothing more than that. It's just describing the way the light travels across the surface that you're painting on. That is the way the light is traveling across the surface of the eye. Now it's important to separate the areas of light and dark primarily. So as we add more and more values, this value here is a little bit more neutral and it's cooler in color. But as I add all these variations of value, I do not want to lose the primary two-tone relationship. So that is the light and the shadow. I can add as many colors as I want to in the light as long as I don't lose the value distinction between the light and the shadow. As long as you have your distinctions between light and shadow, modeling the form is nothing more than saying, hey, this area is a little bit darker than this area is a little bit lighter than this area optically. And of course you can think about it in terms of, oh, this plane is facing the light more than this other plane. So you can think about it conceptually. So you can think of, say, the light on the eye, that plane is most perpendicular to the light source, or you can just optically look at it and say, hey, that's lighter, I want to paint it lighter. That's fine, as long as you keep track of your light and shadow, the modeling of the form is really something that you can think of in terms of gradating the values in relation to one another. As long as you can relate the values to one another, then you should be able to develop this eye. And this plane here beneath the tear duct is receiving just a little more light, so I'm going to add a little more light to this plane right here. Another reason I'm introducing this idea of a pivot to you is because I oftentimes say just keep the painting simple and easy to understand with, working from general to specific. But I want there to be a point, and I want to clarify that point, at which we build. I always say, let's lay something down that we can understand and that we can build from, but I want us to be able to build. And so practice painting eyes on the side, um, on little 5x5 panels or anything like that. Practicing how to develop eyes can really help you in terms of your development in the entire portrait. The eyes are really a good place to lock onto. In any individual, the eyes are a really good place to latch onto. Logistically, the eye is much more difficult to move around than something like the nose or the mouth or the chin even. The eyes are very difficult to move. So we really want to nail the placement of the eyes, if anything. The eyes themselves and the specific angle between them, I feel like I have to get at them first. Just put my foot down on the eyes first, and then I will move down to the nose and then to the mouth and gauge them in relation to the eyes. But first and foremost, I had my pivot, which was the eye to the right of the screen, and now we're going to develop the eye to the left of the screen. As long as I have the distance between them worked out and I have the angle between them worked out, I can further develop the forms. And like I said, practice painting eyes on the side, perhaps on little 5x5 panels or anything like that. And know yourself, know how long it takes you to paint an eye, know what you understand about the eyes in terms of the structure of the eye sitting within the eye socket, the planes of the upper eyelid, the planes and the curvatures associated with the anatomy of the eyes. Study that in pencil. So study the anatomy, the structure of the eye in pencil, and then paint as many of them as you can in oil, and understand yourself. Know how long it takes for you. And even doing master copies of paintings of just an eye, a section of an eye. So of course, doing master copies of John Singer Sargent paintings where you look at how simple he painted the eyes. Diego Velázquez would be a good one to look at. Rembrandt would be an excellent one to look at. The conversation between the artist and the paint in terms of the creative process is how much do I need to put down? How much do I need to put down to say what I want to say? And how can I minimize the amount that I need to put down so that each bit of information is that much more valuable in terms of the overall development of the picture? So what I'm trying to establish here is a clear delineation between light and shadow, and I'm trying to portray the upper eyelid and the lower eyelid and the curvature of that spherical structure of the white of the eye known as the sclera, and then a little bit of the pink as we approach the tear duct. And nothing more than that, though of course I'm going to try to shape the iris of the eye into more of that round looking structure instead of the linear thing that I have. So just little bits and pieces of information. And of course, I want the eye to the left of the panel to match the development of the pivot. So the pivot is the model's left eye. So I want to work the eye to the left and the eye to the right as equally as possible. I don't want to render one eye more than the other. Now there can be situations such as the shadow of the model's left eye where I see almost nothing. And so if I don't see anything there, I'm not going to put anything there. But I want the development of the eye to the left of the panel here to match as closely as possible to the pivot, that is the eye to the right of the panel. So based on the pivot, I see now that I have too much showing on the right side of the face. So I'm going to go back in with the dark of the hair with my uh, little size 1 round brush, the dark brush, and I'm going to just carve into it. It's just paint. I can easily carve into the shape and make it more accurate. And if I have cut too much into it, then I'll move a little bit back out. It's not a problem. And the way that I'm gauging that this distance needs to cut back in just a little bit is based on just bouncing my eye back and forth. I could still have it kind of wrong, but I'm giving my eyes the opportunity to help me decide where I need to adjust certain shapes. So just by bouncing my eye back and forth from the reference and the picture that I'm working on, I can see now that the nose is too far down. Oops, I made the nose too far down. But like I said before, logistically, it is easier to push a nose up or to push a mouth up than it is to move the eyes. And so with that big oops moment, I had the nose a little bit too long. I'm going to move it up very easily with just a simple shape, and then I'm going to follow through with the bottom of the cast shadow of the nose with a similar color mixture to what I had on the bottom, very easily moving it up. And with the corner of the nose, I actually try to use the tear ducts of the eyes. You may have saw me earlier just like wave a straight line between the tear duct and the corner of the nose. So I use that vertical relationship between the tear duct and the bottom corner of each nose, that is this area here that I'm now carving into. And of course I want to be very careful with the angle of the nose. The angle of the nose, so that dark value to the left of the nose, I'm trying to get that angle as accurate as I can. And I'm going to use the model's eye to the left to help me gauge what that angle is. And now still bouncing my eyes back and forth between the reference and the picture that I'm working on, I'm still just using my eyes to figure out the overall drawing and proportion of things. But if anything, I hope that you noticed that from that simple shape that I had for the nose, of course I had the nose too long, but it was very easy to push that shape up a little bit. And the way that I'm gauging the distance of the nose is in relation to the eyes, in relation to the pivot. Notice now I'm making that straight line movement gesture between the edge of the nose and the tear duct, very simply relating them to one another. And so here we have just a few shapes onto the nose that we added. Now we're going to construct on top of them. And now you can see the importance of that pivot, having the pivot to help me relate shapes to one another, and gauging the nose in relation to the eyes. Now I'm going to think of shape, value, and color for the nose. I want to get the shapes of light and dark as accurately as I can, and I'm thinking about that primarily two-dimensionally, just looking at the shape itself. So I want to get the shape of light and dark, and I'm using just a little bit of my cerulean blue with the raw umber and a tad bit of ivory black and a touch of alizarin crimson for this shape right here. Very simply trying to feel out the angle and the distance of this shadow. And I perceive it to be a little bit cooler than the surrounding colors. So perceptually, to me, it's cooler. So I'm going to push it a little bit cooler with that cerulean blue and make it darker with the raw umber. And to not make it too cold, I added just a little bit of the alizarin crimson. And so I had the shape, I had the value being dark but not straight black, and then I thought about the color. And so now I'm going to move on to the light on the nose. This is the wing of the nose and the wing of the model's left nose. This area here is a little bit lighter, so it's picking up more light. I made it lighter in value, and the color is a little bit more pink than the surrounding areas. So that mixture was probably just a little bit of my zinc white and some of the alizarin crimson and perhaps a tad bit of the sap green. Now we're moving on to the top plane of the bulb of the nose. So this is the bulb of the nose. Notice the highlight that I just placed there. And what I said about eyes, practicing painting eyes on little 5x5s, I'm going to say the same thing with the nose and with the mouth. Practice painting noses and mouths on their own. And then notice how you paint them, how much time it takes for you to paint them. And then you'll get a better idea of how long each individual segment of the painting will take you. All it is 2 eyes, a nose, and a mouth inside of the structure of the head. That's all it is. Study each individual component individually as much as you can, and study them together as much as you can in a portrait like this one, just to get an idea of how long it takes you to paint each individual section. Just see it as a series of units that work together in a whole. Using a vertical line, just making a vertical line gesture from the corner of the mouth to the eye, probably the iris of the eye. I'm trying to figure out now the placement of the mouth. So with the mouth, after placing down the nose in relation to the pivot, that is the eyes, I can start off with the top area of the upper lip. So with the mouth, I really try to picture the distance of the philtrum, the length of the philtrum. And the philtrum is that teardrop looking thing that we all have, or that teardrop looking thing that we have above the middle of our lips that connects to the middle of our nose. The distance of that philtrum, to me, I'm going to use my pivot here. I think it's a little bit bigger than the total distance of the top of the eye to the bottom of the eye. So that is, I can fit an entire eye within the distance between the nose and the mouth, and just a little bit more. Just a little bit more. So that's the kind of language that's going on in my head in terms of the distance of the philtrum. Too often it's really easy to make the philtrum too long or make it too short. So trying to gauge exactly the distance between the bottom of the nose and the top of the upper lip isn't that difficult if we think about the shape and the length of the philtrum. So now with the mouth, I have just some basic shapes of light and dark. I have some dark for the inside of the mouth and some dark for the bottom of the lower lip. And now we're going to get into a little bit of the expression. So the model in this picture has a very unique expression, and as I was taking photo references of her, I think she was talking to her friend or something, but that moment that I captured with the mouth just a little bit open, I don't know what it was, but to me that was a beautiful image, and I really wanted to capture the expression. So that might have something to do with my own taste in aesthetics, but I like something about having the mouth just a little bit open like this. I don't know, it evokes some type of questioning in my mind, and she looks curious or whatever it is. I like the aesthetic of having the mouth just a little bit open like this. So now with the development of the mouth, I see this area here catching a little bit of light to the right of the picture, the right of the mouth. This area here is catching a little bit more light, and it's a little bit cooler too. So that mixture is probably just raw umber with a little bit of the cadmium yellow and maybe a little bit of the ivory black just to neutralize the saturation of the cadmium yellow. And so now for the corners of the mouth, I really want to gauge the corner to the left of the mouth in relation to the corner of the right of the mouth. Notice now I'm working side by side from one side of the mouth to the other side of the mouth. I'm going to use the brush to form a horizontal line, and I'm even going to close one eye as I gauge these 2 points. Remember the 2 red points of the tear ducts that I used for the eyes? I'm doing the same kind of thing with the mouth. I really want to gauge the angle of the mouth. It's somewhat reminiscent of the eyes, but a very, very slight angle. And now with the teeth, there is a little glimpse of the teeth showing. And oftentimes teeth are something very difficult to portray, even if it's just a little glimpse of the teeth. And so I'm going to go more for a cooler color for the teeth rather than a warmer color, if you know what I mean. I'm not trying to go for a yellow type of color. I'm trying to go for more of a cool blue, neutral kind of color for the teeth, and just a single shape for the teeth. I'm not trying to show too much of it, but just a glimpse of it. And now I'm going to go back to the upper lip, the area right next to the philtrum, and I want to make sure that that shape is as well established as possible. I'm looking at the negative shape between the top of the upper lip and the cast shadow of the nose. I want to make sure that little bit of light is as accurate as I can describe it in terms of the shape of that light. And I'm going to go back in with a little bit more light onto the teeth, just a little bit. Teeth is pretty much a push and pull how much you want to show. It's a good idea to make a brush stroke like that one and to step back maybe 5 feet and see what the painting looks like. Come back, notice you put too much of the teeth, then go back with a little bit more of the dark value. And here's where a little bit more creative expression goes into the development of the painting, because you can really pick and choose how much information that you want to put in. There is no definitive answer, and I don't think there should be, to what a painting should and should not have. So that's oftentimes the criticism of realism, or humanist realism, or whatever you want to call it, the art of trying to paint something as it looks like to you. There's really a great variety of different ways an artist can choose to simplify forms. I just so happen to choose to push the yellow in the light a little bit above the philtrum, and I chose to show just a little bit of the teeth, and I chose to have a more dark blue accent beneath the bottom lip. And another artist can use a different kind of simplification, and that's all up to the way you perceive things, as long as you follow things such as maintaining your light in your light, maintaining the shadow in the shadow, that is making sure you don't lose your distinction between light and shadow, and you apply the values according to the direction of the light source. As long as you maintain the fundamentals, you will get a picture that looks similar to the model that you're painting, but the way that you portray it is really what enables you to express your own inner creativity. Alright, so now let's gauge where the painting is at. So let's do another checkpoint as I paint this lighter pink on the cheek. Now we established our pivot and we modeled each individual feature based on that pivot. So we used the pivot that is the eye to the right of this panel, to gauge where each feature needed to be, and then rendered them after figuring out exactly where to place them. And so now we are at a stage where we want to work the structures of the cheekbone yet again. the angle of the jaw, and the values surrounding the features of the face. So oftentimes we work outside shape, that is what we did in the beginning. We did the big shapes of color, and then the shapes, the inside shapes, that is the features, we figured out the features. And now we're going to be further developing the large structure of the model's face, so the larger forms, so like the cheekbone, the forehead, the mandible, the neck, the chin. And of course, I'm going to go back into the dark values of the hair yet again. So remember, I really want to build these values. So I added another layer to the dark of the hair with just paint. I tried not to use any medium at all, so just paint. And hopefully that should be the last uh, bit of dark that I apply. So now I'm going to go in with some of the halftone colors that I use for the flesh, and I'm going to use that for the little bit of light that's going to be portrayed in the hair. Now with hair, you really want to think about some of the same things that we were talking about with the development of the portrait. So let's think about hair in terms of shapes of light, dark, areas that are facing the light more, areas that are not facing the light as much. And so I kind of did some of that while I was filling in the dark of the hair. So let's explain what it is I was doing. So if you see the little glimpse of the model's left ear to the right of the panel, uh, the area beneath that to me is physically the area that's receiving, in my opinion, the least amount of light. So that is the area that I tried to push as dark as possible. Still trying to, I'm trying to avoid using straight black, because anything that's straight black uh, tends to jump out, and especially areas in the shadow, I don't really want them to jump out. Now with the bits and pieces of light in the hair, they may seem very cool in temperature, but I'm going to be kind of careful not to paint any of the lights of the hair anywhere near the grayish kind of color scheme. So a kind of general rule of thumb with color: eyes, avoid anything that's warm. Eyes, definitely avoid that. Anything pink in the eyes is a no-no. Same with the teeth. I don't want to push it warm. I don't want anything overly, say, in the yellow side, if you know what I mean. And then with the hair, depending on the model, with this one, I definitely did not want to put any of the lights in the hair anywhere near the gray, if you know what I mean there. I didn't want any kind of gray tones in the hair. That's why I used the flesh tones for the hair. And so now to further develop the structure of the model's face, as we were talking about before, it's very much just describing the way that the form turns around the face. So painting in this dark value here is a dark light. So this is a dark light. This is the area in the light just before we hit the shadow. So I know that there is a shadow on the model's right side. Conceptually, I know that there's a shadow there, so that's why I placed that darker value, and of course turning the form. So now I'm going to use a horizontal line to place the ear in relation to the nose. So the ear is almost plumb on a horizontal in relation to the bottom of the nose. Plumb meaning matching up. So the bottom of the nose almost matches up perfectly with the ear. So close to matching up on a horizontal, but the ear is just a little bit lower on a horizontal, just a little bit lower than the nose. That little tiny difference is what's going on in my head. It's plumb on a horizontal, but just a little bit lower. And the hue of the ear is pretty much more on the pinkish side, very similar to the pink on the cheeks, but the value is a little bit darker than that of the dark on the model's cheekbone. And so that's pretty much it. I'm just going to put some light accents for the ear and some dark accents. So that was the dark accent right there. I'm going to make it even darker here. So just some light accents and some dark accents for the ear. I don't want to overwork anything near the ear. I can barely see it on the model, so I'm not going to paint anything that I don't see for the ear. Now just a little bit of light touch here just to show just a little glimpse of light. And that's about it for the ear. So now hopefully you can see a little bit of the pushing of the light that I was talking about before when I was painting this section on the bottom of the neck. And so you can now see, hopefully, that there is a shimmering light or an effect of light being portrayed, as all the values and the colors should be, in theory, working together with one another to create a light effect. I did push the light on this area on the bottom of the neck a little bit, and I did push the color difference a little bit. I did see it to be a little bit more on the greenish, coolish greenish side, so I did use my cadmium yellow with my raw umber, and I think I added a little bit of my more pink mixtures just to get that color to sit in a little bit better. So now just using my cadmium red light and my zinc white, I'm going to mix up as bright as a pink as I can, add a little bit of cadmium orange to it. So zinc white, remember zinc white is a transparent white. It's a very thin white, so it allows me to bring up the value of a color a little bit without losing too much of the intensity of that color. And so in any case, I'm going to be adding just a little more of a glimpse of light onto the lips. I don't see too much information on this area, this particular region of the lips, so I'm not going to put too much information, but I do see that this little area here is a little bit more on the reddish pink side, so a little bit more cadmium red light into that mixture, and I'm going to push it a little bit over to the right side here. And this is why I like to use synthetic brushes, because I can very easily just whisper the paint onto this plane. Just gently whisper the paint on here. A little bit more red, closer to the middle. Gonna fan it out a little bit. Remember that fanning of the color just helps to take down the glare, and it also softens it a little bit. So that is a nice reason to have synthetic brushes, because they can create such nice soft edges, and they can create sharp edges when you want them to. And so in the end here, I'm going to just be taking a little synthetic brush, and I'm going to be softening some of the edges on the portrait. And this is pretty much just a finishing touch now. I'm just going to be lightly smoothing out some of the edges. And that should be about the final little change that I'll do onto the portrait. And there you have it. I'd like to thank you all so much for watching this week's portrait painting demonstration. I know it was a long video, but I wanted to make something even more comprehensive this week. So thank you so much for watching. I hope it helps you out. I hope you have a great week, and I will see you next time. And if you'd like to see more of my artwork more often, please feel free to check out or follow my Instagram account, and I'll leave a link in the description below to my Instagram page. Thanks again, and I hope you all have a wonderful week, and I'll see you next time.